Martha is Dead gained attention and prominence for two reasons. First, that it had an interactive scene where you cut a woman's face off and wear it over your own. And second, that Sony had asked the developers to make changes on the PlayStation version of the game, leading to a debate over censorship. Despite the controversy on both fronts, Martha is Dead is not a horror game. Hi everyone, I'm Phil and you're watching UnCapt Gaming. Martha is Dead's moments of explicit gore are more shocking because they are fleeting rather than the game being a sea of blood and entrails. In fact, what combat there is in the game, it being set at the end of World War II, largely takes place off-screen, and as a player you have no control of any of it. Rather, this game is a slow-burning psychological thriller, with the gameplay rooted in finding clues and unravelling a mystery, rather than fighting or escaping enemies. I played this game on the PlayStation 5, where the game was subject to changes. The Sony-mandated changes involved two particularly bloody scenes: the face-off scene and the removal of a fetus from a corpse's belly, being changed from playable to non-interactive cutscenes. As it doesn't change the context of the scenes, which aren't glorifying the acts depicted in any way, I can't see any justification for this. But, at the same time, I'm not convinced that being able to play these moments would fundamentally change my experience. The other change is the removal of the depiction in a psychiatric hospital of a woman masturbating until her genitals bleed. I haven't been able to find reference to the uncut content, and I'm not squeamish about such things, but this does appear to step into a puerile and tropey depiction of mental illness. The final change is that in the PlayStation version, the content warning is more explicit about the type of content featured in the game and gives players the option to play a censored version. Given that the content it's warning of isn't just gore, but issues such as self-harm, I feel that this is a positive move. Depictions of self-harm, amongst other things, can tend to trigger a post-traumatic response in those who have experienced this themselves, and so forewarning them so they can make an informed choice on whether and how to proceed in the story can only be a good thing. The game starts with the playable character Giulia finding her twin sister Martha floating in a lake. She hurriedly tosses her clothes aside to dive in and pull Martha out, but it is too late. Martha, as the title of the game suggests, is dead. Shortly, Giulia's mother arrives and mistakes Giulia for Martha, a misidentification that Giulia does nothing to correct, thus taking on her sister's identity. We learn very quickly that Martha, who is deaf and mute, is the favoured child, and that their mother harbours deep resentments towards Giulia. This appears to be the key reason that she so readily accepts Giulia as Martha, meaning that her favourite has survived. The sister's father is presented as a meek counterpart to his wife, and more loving to Giulia. However, he's also a Nazi general, so there's that. The other character of import in the game is Lupo, a friend of Martha and Giulia, and also an anti-fascist partisan. I say character of import rather than character in the game because no other characters truly appear in the game. The story takes place over several days, and in that time nobody besides Giulia really appears before us for more than a few moments. Their stories advance off-screen, through eavesdrop conversations, sounds heard at a distance, and phone calls. Combined with the gameplay, which contains no combat and instead simply has Giulia moving between locations in order to pick up clues, they can develop photographs and so on, this means that the story is not only a slow burner, but also an extremely lonely one. Music in the game is used sparingly and to great effect, leaving you alone with the ambience of the Italian countryside when the sun is at its highest, at the dead of night, and in the fog of the morning. What musical cues we do get, whether in the form of jarring, plucked violin strings or the most tragic rendition of Bella Ciao possible, are used to great effect. It's not a spoiler, I don't think, to say that although Martha is Dead isn't a horror game, it very much is a ghost story. Whether the ghost of the story is real is for you as the player to decide, but it's far from the only area of the plot where what's real and what's invented is up for debate. This game is about solving a mystery, but even the detective's own memories and senses are to be interrogated as we push on through the narrative. Despite the existence of narrative choices throughout the game, the story is a linear one, with the same broad strokes playing out no matter what choices you make. However, what you choose to make of events effectively serves as alternate endings, as pretty much everything is open to interpretation. On the whole, this is done well, until the game comes into its final act. The game gives you the option to censor certain scenes, but whilst graphic, the uncensored version never feels as though it is purely gratuitous or done for shock value. There will be discomfort, but that discomfort is intentional, and it is as much for the emotional and psychological developments underpinning what you're seeing on screen, rather than just for the gore. However, the story ultimately falls into lazy, often harmful tropes about mental illness and violence that serve to deliver a shock twist, but also to completely undercut any claims about taking mental health seriously. The contrast between the messages telling people with mental health issues that they are not alone, and the way the conclusion to the story feeds into the worst stereotypes about mentally ill people is stark, whilst the open-endedness of the plot, left to interpretation on every point, effectively removes any onus from the developers to say anything meaningful about the relationship between mental health, abuse and violence. This is a shame, because Martha is Dead could have been more than it is, and it feels as though it shied away from doing so at the last minute to fall back on an easy resolution with a lack of serious thought put into it. Broadly speaking, the slow and deliberate nature of the gameplay fits with the pacing and the tone of the story. However, there are issues with it. The way the game keeps track of objectives is easy enough to follow and feels almost RPG-like in that it even to an extent has side quests and a level of choice in the order you do things, or whether you do them at all. But this freedom has hard limits, with Giulia turning around and admonishing herself if you attempt to go somewhere at a point where the plot isn't yet ready for it. The minigame aspect of the photography will appeal more to some players than others. The level of pseudo-realism in both taking photos, requiring that you get not only the positioning but also the exposure, focus and filters right, and in the development process is an intriguing mechanic, but can also feel like padding for the lack of much else to do besides move around and pick stuff up. On the main side quest of the game, you will also have to contend with sending telegrams in Morse code and decoding the responses. Working out the message to send is clunky but serviceable. Sending the messages with long or short button presses to represent dots and dashes is a little contrived. Using a not very straightforward key to decode the messages received back and decode them with a second key is nothing short of frustrating, and honestly not worth holding off on just looking up the solution. Beyond that, moving around, especially when you're able to get on your bike, is awkward and clunky anywhere the ground isn't flat and even, such as the woods where you spend an awful lot of time, with invisible barriers all over the place to force you to follow paths that are far easier to read on the map than to see right below your own feet. The first half of my playthrough was defined by regular error messages popping up to interrupt the gameplay due to ill-defined faults. A patch before the second half apparently fixed that, only to replace it with points where the whole game would just freeze and force me to close the game app, reopen, and jump back to wherever I had last saved. There are also portions where it feels incomplete, in particular the phone calls, where almost all of the dialogue is in subtitles, but unaccompanied by any audio. It's worth noting that the game isn't at all accessible. There are very few options to customize the experience beyond adding subtitles, which you cannot change the contrast of. The font of the narrated interludes will be unreadable for some players. The size of the text on the camera UI cannot be changed for those who find it too small. There are no closed captions for audio cues other than dialogue. For example, where you have to find a crow by its cawing and then follow it. I had trouble locating it, even though my only sight impairment is needing glasses for distance. And though the Italian countryside's darkness at night is realistic and atmospheric, it's hard to see where you need to go with good vision, especially when invisible barriers are forcing you to not stray from hard-to-see paths, and no audio cues or high-contrast HUD options are available to compensate for that. Martha is Dead's controversial reputation is artificial. Beyond the shock value talking points, the story is far more sober and thoughtful than might be expected. It does a great job of making you feel lonely, isolated, and not quite sure what is real as you delve deeper into mystery. However, all of this work takes a nosedive in the final act, when its depictions of mental illness retread old tropes and harmful stereotypes. It's also let down by its own gameplay, which has interesting ideas, but which can feel clunky or downright frustrating at points. It also suffers from bugs that need ironing out and a dire lack of accessibility. All of that said, I would say it's worth a playthrough, but maybe wait and get it on sale. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for all things gaming. Let me know in the comments if you've played Martha is Dead and what you thought of it. See you next time.